It began on a quiet August night in rural Texas. A night so ordinary and uneventful that no one, neither the dispatchers in the county office, nor the truckers passing along Highway 277, nor the Lawson family settling into their homes, could have known that those hours would birth one of the most unsettling disappearances in modern American history. The case of Brandon Lawson would eventually be defined by one phone call, a fragmented 911 transmission filled with broken words and fractured meaning. A message from a man who sounded trapped somewhere between fear, confusion, and something far more disturbing. But before the recording became a digital ghost shared endlessly online, before investigators re-examined each second of audio, hoping to extract clarity from chaos, there was simply a man on a dark Texan road. A man who left his home, started his truck, drove into the emptiness of the night, and then vanished as if the land itself had swallowed him. To understand how a normal drive turned into a mystery carved into the collective memory of amateur sleuths, investigators, and families, it is necessary to trace the subtle shifts that defined Brandon's final hours. Those shifts came quietly, almost invisibly, like the faint change in the wind before a storm you cannot yet see. Brandon Lawson was 26 years old, a father, a partner, a man who worked long hours in the oil fields, a man who navigated the exhaustion of physical labor and family responsibilities like thousands of others in rural Texas. He belonged to a world where the nights smelled of dust, diesel, and open plains, where distance was measured not in miles, but in isolation, where a single stretch of highway could feel like a barrier between survival and disaster. He was no stranger to hardship, but he was not the type of person anyone expected to simply disappear. On the evening of August 8, 2013, Brandon left his home after an argument that had none of the finality or danger that hindsight would later attach to it. It was the kind of domestic tension that flares under stress and quiets just as quickly, the kind of disagreement that belongs to the rhythm of everyday life. Yet something in him shifted that night. His partner would later recall that he seemed tired, overwhelmed, and determined to leave the house just long enough to clear his thoughts. No one imagined that stepping out the door would mark the beginning of an irreversible descent into the unknown. Brandon started driving north along Highway 277, a long, open ribbon of asphalt cutting through farmland, brush, and expanses of rural land, where a person could walk for hours without seeing another soul. The stretch between San Angelo and Bronte was quiet at night. Only the faint glow of distant farmhouses broke the darkness. Cell service was unreliable, the terrain uneven, and the silence thick enough to distort the sense of distance and direction. Minutes after midnight, Brandon called his brother, telling him that he had run out of gas somewhere near Bronte. This detail alone was strange. He had left the house with enough fuel to make the drive, and he knew the area well enough to avoid being stranded, but the more significant anomaly came in the tone behind his words. A tone unlike anything his family had heard from him before. Even without direct quotations, accounts describe his voice as erratic, strained, tense in a way that suggested either fear or confusion, and perhaps both. Something was wrong long before the world realized it. His brother, Kyle, offered to bring him a gas can and drove toward the location Brandon described. Meanwhile, Brandon's truck remained stopped near a desolate section of the road, a place where the shoulders were narrow, the brush grew thick, and the night seemed deeper than elsewhere. Passing drivers later reported the hazards reflecting in the darkness, but no sign of movement around the vehicle. Minutes later, the call that would define the case was placed. A 911 dispatcher in Coke County received a transmission so chaotic that even now, Technology and careful human analysis cannot fully decipher its meaning. Brandon's voice cracked through the static, low, hurried, breathless. The recording contained fragments of phrases that hinted at danger, pursuit, and a presence that remains unidentified. Investigators and listeners have debated for years whether Brandon was describing people hiding in the shadows, an accident, a chase, or something else entirely. Something that had no name. The dispatcher, unable to understand the full message, documented the call but had no concrete information to act on. To her, it was another confusing rural emergency call. Unsettling but inconclusive. The true weight of it would only become apparent hours later. Unaware of the 911 call, Kyle arrived near the location where Brandon had said he ran out of gas. He found the truck empty, the doors unlocked, the radio quiet, the engine dead. The vehicle showed no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no footprints that clearly revealed direction. It was as though Brandon had stepped into the darkness and dissolved into it. What happened next remains one of the most debated gaps in the timeline. Brandon was on the phone at various moments with Kyle and with authorities. But the conversations were fragmented by poor reception, distortion, and the disturbance in his voice that suggested panic. His words carried urgency, but no clear description of his surroundings. At moments, it seemed as though he believed someone was following him. At others, the confusion in his tone suggested he might have been injured, disoriented, or running from an unseen threat. The terrain around the road was unkind. Thick brush extended for miles. The uneven ground was littered with holes, rocks, and sharp vegetation. At night, the darkness was total, and a person could wander only a few dozen meters before becoming completely disoriented. Even with flashlights, visibility was minimal. This landscape would later shape theories that Brandon became lost or collapsed from exhaustion. But none of these explanations fully align with the urgency captured in the 911 recording. Police arrived shortly after Kyle and surveyed the scene. They had no reason to suspect foul play. They believed Brandon was hiding to avoid an outstanding warrant related to a past charge. This assumption shaped the early hours of the investigation, causing authorities to treat the disappearance not as an emergency, but as a voluntary avoidance of law enforcement. That perspective cost time. Time that, if misused, can shape the outcome of such cases forever. Search efforts that night were small and limited. Officers scanned the roadside, shined flashlights into the brush, and called out for Brandon. Nothing answered. The land swallowed sound as effortlessly as it swallowed light. When dawn rose over Coke County, there was no sign of him. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, not a single physical proof that a man had moved through the land. The truck remained where he left it, a silent witness with no testimony to offer. The 911 call, once a confusing oddity, now grew into a central pillar of fear. The family replayed it repeatedly, searching for clues, tone changes, background noises. Anything that would explain why Brandon sounded so terrified and why he disappeared so completely. Days turned into weeks. Ground searches expanded. Helicopters scanned the area. Cadaver dogs were deployed. Volunteers walked grid patterns across open land. Investigators traced possible travel routes, studied cell tower pings, and interviewed anyone who had been near the road that night. Yet nothing surfaced. Not even the smallest sign that Brandon had moved through the area. It was as though he had passed through a door in the landscape that no one else could see. Theories emerged quickly. Some believed he was chased by unknown assailants and fled into the brush, where he collapsed from injury or exhaustion. Others suspected a hallucination, perhaps brought on by stress, medication interactions, or environmental factors. A few believed he may have encountered something criminal in the dark. Drug traffickers, armed individuals, or people with intentions that remain unclear. There were also theories that focused on the unnatural stillness of the area, the strange acoustics of the land, the way sound distorts at night and creates illusions of threats that are not there. But none of these theories could explain the most haunting aspect of the case. The 911 call. A message broken by static and fear, spoken by a man who seemed to know he had no time left. As the search expanded, the land was mapped in detail. Investigators studied drainage areas, creeks, fence lines, private property, abandoned structures, and miles of brush, and they found nothing. The absence of evidence became the most significant evidence. Because disappearances in rural environments rarely leave no trace at all, a body, clothing, personal items, footprints, disturbed vegetation, something always remains. But here there was nothing, and that nothing grew heavier as time passed. For Brandon's family, the uncertainty became suffocating. They watched the public dissect the case, listened to strangers analyze audio recordings, and endured waves of speculation that ranged from sympathetic to accusatory. They clung to the belief that Brandon had been in genuine danger that night, that he had tried to communicate it, that he had not run away, but had been running from something unseen, something unrecorded, something that the land refused to reveal. Months slipped by and the case hardened into a true American enigma. A single phone call surrounded by silence. For every detail that seemed clear, another contradicted it. For every answer found, new questions formed. Brandon's truck became a symbol of the story. A vehicle parked on the edge of nowhere, waiting for a driver who would never return. Years later, the disappearance still resists explanation. But to understand how deep the mystery goes, how strange the evidence becomes, and how one man's final actions unravel into a labyrinth of contradictions, it is necessary to go further into the investigation, into the theories, into the forensics, and into the last places anyone believes Brandon might have been. The disappearance of Brandon Lawson entered its second phase, not with discovery, but with deepening contradictions. By the time the initial shock of the missing person report faded, the case had already slipped into a realm where logic fractured, timelines twisted, and evidence refused to align. What seemed at first like a simple case of a stranded motorist abandoning his vehicle became something far more elusive. Something shaped by the shifting intersections of terrain, psychology, law enforcement assumptions, family insistence, and a single, cryptic 911 call that no one could fully decipher. The case should have anchored itself in evidence, yet the evidence was either missing, contradictory, or impossible to interpret. The more investigators tried to map the events of that night, the more the timeline scattered like sand in the wind. In the days following the disappearance, the cell phone ping data became one of the earliest pillars investigators hoped would provide clarity. At first glance, it seemed straightforward. Brandon's phone had connected with a tower near Bronte, but rural Texan cellular coverage in 2013 was inconsistent, directional, and prone to anomalies caused by terrain. The landscape around Highway 277 included slopes, drainage ditches, clusters of brush, and open plains that altered signal routes in unpredictable ways. Instead of confirming his precise location, the towers created a broad search radius that offered little more than the knowledge that he was somewhere within a wide, circular grid of land. Within that grid were creeks, barbed wire fences, ranch properties, grazing fields, and stretches of land so densely overgrown that searchers could walk within a few meters of a body without ever seeing it. The environment itself became an adversary. Texas heat baked the soil by day, and insects, animals, and natural decomposition altered any trace left behind in mere hours. For a missing man on foot, this landscape was merciless. For investigators searching for proof of his path, it was a labyrinth capable of erasing movements almost instantly. As days turned into weeks, the investigation deepened into the enigmatic centerpiece of the case, the 911 call. The recording was analyzed repeatedly by authorities, journalists, audio technicians, and thousands of internet sleuths. Each group attempted to extract clarity from a recording born of chaos. Static bled into the words, background noises interlaced with Brandon's voice. The callers seemed to be speaking quickly, as though the seconds were slipping away from him. At times his tone carried fear, at times confusion, and at times the strained focus of someone trying desperately to communicate danger despite failing faculties. No matter how often listeners replayed the recording, the meaning shifted depending on perception. Some believed Brandon was describing an attack, convinced he was being followed or ambushed on the roadside by unknown individuals. Others believed he had witnessed something criminal and fled. Still others thought he was injured, delirious, or experiencing disorientation caused by a medical issue or environmental stress. Every interpretation had a counterpart that disputed it. Every possible meaning generated an alternative that canceled it out. The dispatcher had documented the call without realizing its future significance. Rural dispatchers often received incoherent transmissions. Drunken callers, injured motorists, individuals under the influence, prank calls, broken connections, panicked accidents. But what stood out in hindsight was not simply the disjointed content, but the tone behind it. There was urgency without clarity, fear without specifics, and a sense of immediate threat that the dispatcher could not act on because she lacked enough information to categorize it as an emergency requiring active pursuit. Despite this, the audio would later become central to the narrative surrounding Brandon's disappearance. Armchair investigators spent years dissecting its frequencies. Some filtered it, isolated channels, adjusted pitch, removed static, slowed it down, or used spectrographic analysis. The result was always the same. The recording offered no consistent interpretation. Each cleaned version revealed different layers, different perceived words, different theories that collapsed upon scrutiny. Meanwhile, the land itself yielded nothing. In the weeks that followed, the search expanded dramatically. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the plains, shining infrared cameras toward the ground. If Brandon was lying in brush or trapped in a ditch, the image would have captured a body-shaped heat mass. But after several flights, the cameras revealed no such shapes. Search dogs were brought in, cadaver dogs trained to detect the faintest traces of decomposition. They followed multiple routes, but found no conclusive scent trails. Some handlers believed the dogs briefly alerted near fences or creek beds, but nothing concrete stemmed from these indications. The failure of the dogs led to another unsettling realization. Either Brandon had never moved far from the area where his truck was found, or the land had erased his presence too thoroughly to detect. The lack of evidence seemed almost unnatural in its totality. Even in cases where a person wanders deep into rural land and succumbs to exposure, search teams typically find clues. Clothing snagged on thorns, footprints in soft soil, disturbances in tall grass, traces of blood or vomit. But here, nothing surfaced. As the investigation developed, attention turned gradually toward the activities and assumptions of the first officers on the scene. Initially, law enforcement believed Brandon was hiding because of an outstanding warrant. An assumption that heavily influenced their response. Officers treated the disappearance as a voluntary evasion rather than a potential emergency. They conducted only a surface-level search that night, checking the basic perimeter and shining lights into the darkness. This was not a full-scale rescue operation. It was an inspection limited by the belief that the missing man was not in danger, but simply avoiding contact. This assumption, Brandon's family later insisted, cost critical hours during which he may have been alive, injured, or lost. If he had been attempting to flag down help in the darkness, every minute mattered. Yet the search that night lacked urgency because the officers did not interpret the situation as life-threatening. The following morning, when family members attempted to involve more extensive law enforcement assistance, they encountered bureaucratic delay. Some agencies believed the case belonged to others, while others insisted they lacked jurisdiction. This confusion added further delay to the growing crisis. By the time a serious search began, the landscape had already begun its natural process of erasing footprints, dispersing scents, and swallowing evidence. Still, investigators refused to abandon the case. They interviewed locals living within miles of the disappearance site. Some reported seeing or hearing nothing unusual. Others mentioned distant noises that could not be distinguished from natural nighttime disturbances. A few described headlights along the road, but nothing definitively tied to the disappearance. Gradually, the focus shifted to the environment. The land around Highway 277 became a key subject of analysis. The terrain consisted of dense mesquite brush, prickly pear cactus, uneven ground, and drainage areas filled with loose soil. A person could fall into a ditch only a few feet deep and become invisible from the road. Coyotes and other scavengers roamed the area, capable of disturbing remains beyond recognition within days. The heat accelerated decomposition, while insects completed the process far more quickly than in cooler climates. Despite these harsh realities, the absence of any remains baffled seasoned search teams. Even in the most difficult terrain, something almost always surfaces: bones, clothing, personal effects. Yet for Brandon, there was nothing. The peculiarity of the case grew further when investigators mapped the distances involved. If Brandon had walked in any direction for more than 20 minutes, he would have encountered a landmark. Fence lines, ranch property borders, side roads, bridges, or creeks. Yet no such locations contained traces of him. This raised another question. Had he truly walked far? Or had something happened to him close to the place where his truck was found? While the terrain consumed physical clues, the psychological dimensions of the case deepened. Those who studied Brandon's behavior before and during the disappearance noticed patterns of stress, urgency, and possible fear. Some believed he encountered individuals who intended to harm him. Others theorized that he may have been hallucinating or disoriented. One possibility explored was an accidental fall into a hidden crevice or thick brush area that searchers inadvertently bypassed. The land, especially near creeks and fence lines, contained drop-offs concealed by overgrowth. A person falling into such an area might sustain injuries preventing mobility or the ability to call for help, but even such a scenario usually leaves evidence. Broken branches, disturbed soil, torn clothing. These were not found. Another theory involved the possibility that Brandon continued to move long after losing contact with his family. His brother Kyle later described hearing faint sounds during their calls. Momentary background noises that could have indicated movement, terrain navigation, or the presence of something nearby. The sounds, however, were too faint and too distorted by poor reception to interpret. As the months stretched into years, the 911 call attracted global attention. Analysts noted that the recording included strange pauses, abrupt shifts in tone, and faint background noises that could be interpreted in various ways. Some believed the background contained the sound of vehicles. Others thought they heard wind, brush, or even distant human voices. none of these interpretations were universally accepted. The most haunting aspect of the audio, however, was the emotional undercurrent behind Brandon's voice. He sounded desperate, pressured, and aware of a threat that listeners could not identify. His tone conveyed the urgency of someone who believed he had only moments to communicate danger. Yet the words he used lacked the clarity needed to decipher the nature of that danger. Theories proliferated. Some suggested a confrontation with unknown individuals. Others pointed to accidental injury leading to panic and confusion. A few even speculated on the possibility of rapid-onset medical conditions, psychological distress, or environmental toxins. Former law enforcement officers contributed their own hypotheses, shaped by experience with similar cases, but none of these theories could account for the absolute disappearance of physical evidence. The investigation continued sporadically over the next decade. Drone technology was used to map the area from above, revealing no signs of human remains. Survey teams revisited the most likely locations, but their searches returned the same results: emptiness, silence, and unanswered questions. For the Lawson family, the case became a daily burden. They replayed the 911 call countless times, each time hoping for clarity that never arrived. They pushed for renewed searches, petitioned agencies, and maintained public awareness of the case. Their pain was compounded by the uncertainty surrounding the final hours of Brandon's life. The land near Highway 277 remained unchanged, as if guarding whatever secrets it held. The truck, once the central piece of physical evidence, became merely a symbol of the enigma. The 911 call remained a riddle trapped in sound waves. Years passed before any significant development occurred. In 2022, human remains were discovered in a field near the disappearance site. They were later confirmed as belonging to Brandon Lawson, though the precise cause of death remains undetermined due to decomposition. The discovery closed some aspects of the case, but opened darker questions. His remains were found in an area previously searched multiple times, raising doubts about the thoroughness of the early searches or the possibility that environmental factors hid the remains for years. Even with the remains identified, the timeline, circumstances, and meaning of the 911 call remain unresolved. The cause of death could not be determined, and the recorded message still contains more ambiguity than answers. The case of Brandon Lawson endures not because of what is known, but because of what remains unexplained. A young father vanished into open land with no witnesses, no clear evidence, and a single, fractured recording that hints at something more sinister than environmental misfortune. The 911 call, though partially understood, still emanates an unsettling sense of dread. An artifact of a moment when a man believed he had only seconds to communicate a threat he could not describe. The land offered nothing but silence. The investigation offered nothing but speculation. Time offered nothing but the certainty that some questions would never be answered. What happened to Brandon Lawson on that Texas night remains suspended between fear and mystery. A story carved into the silence of rural America. A story defined by a voice calling out into the darkness and receiving nothing in return. And to this day, the final truth remains somewhere out on Highway 277, undiscovered, unspoken, and perhaps forever unreachable.